Welcome to Deals and Disputes with the West Webb Law Group.
Welcome to today's episode of Deals and Disputes with West Webb, Albritton, and Gentry, where we explore some of the most pressing legal challenges of our time with today's focus on climate change litigation. Our guest today is Oliver Peter Thoma, an attorney with extensive experience representing some of the biggest companies in the world, with a career that spans industries such as energy, public utilities, chemicals, life sciences, and manufacturing. Oliver has tackled a wide range of complex legal issues, including commercial disputes, construction, mass torts, and government enforcement actions. As the world grapples with the escalating environmental crisis, the legal landscape surrounding climate change is rapidly evolving. From regulatory challenges to corporate responsibility, Oliver will help us understand how businesses and individuals can navigate the legal complexities tied to climate policy, sustainability, and environmental compliance. That's quite the resume, Oliver. Welcome.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Well, can you start by giving us an overview of what climate change litigation is and why it's become such a focal point for the legal world?
Sure. Well, climate change is an important public issue, and there's a lot of debate and discussion around it. And what has happened in the last 10 years in particular is that the courts have really become the place for this public debate to play out. People are not satisfied with the lack of movement that they see in the legislative and executive branch. And so you see both governments, state and local governments, as well as individual like environmental activist groups or public interest groups using the courts to litigate what they think should be done about climate change. And so that usually comes up in two major ways. One being, trying to force a government to change its policies. And then more often than not in the US, lots of individual lawsuits brought against fossil fuel companies where the plaintiffs feel like the fossil fuel companies should bear some responsibility for the impacts of climate change.
And we've watched, climate change evolve, since we're kids over the last few decades. And what key legal milestones do you feel have marked its growth?
Well, I think in particular, climate change litigation was something that was a very new idea that started really, there were some suits trickling in the 1980s and 90s, but it wasn't until the early 2000s where you saw individuals try to take a run at using the court system to affect change in climate change. And so at the beginning, we're thinking about the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s, where public interest groups would bring lawsuits against the federal government in particular, saying, hey, we don't think that you are taking this seriously. And they would use different administrative procedures to try to challenge the government, what they perceived as the government's lack of action on certain climate goals. But that morphed into individual plaintiffs, oftentimes following some sort of environmental natural disaster like hurricanes. For instance, in the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina, there was a group of fishermen that gathered together and filed lawsuits against oil and gas companies. And there they were challenging those oil and gas companies' direct emissions, saying that for all of the efforts of extraction and production that generate greenhouse gases in oil and gas businesses, that you should be held responsible. And those lawsuits were typically filed in federal court. And the federal courts at that time said, no, the oil and gas companies should not be held liable under individual tort theories. So taking a step back, when we think about the types of lawsuits that people file, when individuals like private citizens or state and local governments file lawsuits against companies, we've seen this with opioids, we've seen this with tobacco, really first and foremost, they use what's called tort law. And that's simply when you injure me, I can sue you to recover my damages that the injury has caused. And so they would use that tort law theories to try to recover against individuals based primarily on how many greenhouse gases they emitted into the environment. The theory being that, well, if you put out so many greenhouse gases, that'll cause all these injuries to me. But the federal courts really dismissed those early on, saying that, look, this is a problem for Congress, the US Congress to deal with. There's already the Clean Air Act. We have the EPA. There's regulations about what companies can and cannot do with emissions. And so those suits really went away. And then starting in 2017, you saw lots of state attorneys general and individual municipalities partner with the plaintiff lawyers, many of whom have experience in environmental litigation, but also taking that playbook from the tobacco litigation and saying, hey, look, we're an outside plaintiff group. The state doesn't have to spend any money on this. We'll take the risk on ourselves, and we'll try to sue these oil and gas companies for billions of dollars under various tort theories. And so that started in 2017, and now we have well over 30 of those cases pending currently in the United States today.
Oh, wow. Yeah. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but public interest groups, environmental activists, they've been key players in climate change litigation. How have they leveraged the legal system to address climate concerns, and have these cases been successful?
Great question. The particular groups have had kind of two attacks. One is a really, what I'll call a technical attack on individual permitting. So large facilities, particularly in heavy manufacturing, oil and gas refineries, or maybe it's not where the oil and gas is refined, but you'll have these places, particularly along the eastern or western seaboard, where there's these big terminals that come off the ocean. So these tankers developing natural gas or oil, they have to deliver it and store it somewhere, and then that's distributed out through that part of the United States. And so those places require permits, because when you have that much oil and gas or chemicals, sitting in these large terminals, these tanks, there's a lot of different regulations, and they have to apply and get renewed permitting every so often. And so environmental groups have taken one technical tactic where they will really challenge those permits and say, oh no, such and such a state, you really shouldn't give so-and-so a permit because we don't think that they've taken the environmental impacts of climate change seriously. And so that's where you've seen that sort of technical approach. And there's been some mixed success, but not any big standout wins for the environmental plaintiffs on that side. And then the other aspect is individuals, usually it's groups of kids, filing these, saying that their constitutional rights to a clean environment had been violated. And so we saw in Oregon where a group of kids banded together to file a suit against the federal government saying, no, we don't think that you've done your job. You're violating U.S. constitutional rights by not adequately taking into consideration how federal government policies might be contributing to climate change. But they lost that suit. Whereas in Montana, there's a pending case right now where similar concept, but instead of suing on the federal constitution, there's a number of states in the United States who their state constitution has an environmental rights amendment where it essentially says citizens of such and such a state, in this case, Montana, have a fundamental right to a clean environment. And a court there in Montana held that that is true and that the state of Montana did not adequately comply with that fundamental right in the way that it was dealing with permitting and environmental assessments in the state of Montana. So I think that success there for those environmental plaintiffs is still pending an outcome from that Supreme Court, but I'd say it's been a mixed bag so far.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And also in recent years, we've seen an uptick in lawsuits targeting corporations, obviously, especially fossil fuel companies, over their role in climate change. What's driving this surge, and what impact could these lawsuits have on corporate accountability?
Well, I think that there's two pieces there. There's the private or the tort lawsuits, rather, that are being filed by the state attorneys general, these municipalities, partnering with these outside plaintiffs' law firms, where they seek billions of dollars in damages, and oftentimes not just money damages, for dealing with the impacts of climate change, but also asking oil and gas companies to stop doing certain things, whether it's how they market oil and gas or how many greenhouse gases they produce. And then there is what you just mentioned, the corporate accountability side, where you see some partnerships between private institutions and federal government and some state governments, where they're starting to require certain disclosures. So we think about the SEC, for publicly traded companies, there's various rules that the SEC requires them to comply with. And one that's being disputed now is in the climate disclosure category. So it's not a final rule yet. It's been challenged and has not gone into effect. But then you have states like California, where they have requiring, it's a new law, several laws actually, where they're requiring these corporations to, anyone who does business, you don't have to necessarily be based in California. It's just if you do any certain amount of business in California, you may be required to report on the types of emissions that you put out. And so you're seeing these corporate responsibility sort of acts come about, and they're all being heavily challenged and litigated. And so it will be interesting to see where those go. And then the lawsuits that have been filed directly against oil and gas companies in particular. I mentioned that there are over 30 of those pending throughout the United States. And I think a key driver there is, if those individual jurisdictions and the plaintiff's lawyer, the outside plaintiff's lawyers, can recover billions of dollars, that's a big payday. And so you see them following a similar playbook of what the plaintiff's lawyers did during the tobacco litigation in the 1990s.
One emerging trend is climate-related human rights lawsuits. How are courts addressing the intersection of human rights and climate change? And can you give an example of a landmark case in this area?
Sure. I mentioned a minute ago, in the United States, the landmark case so far has really been the Held v. Montana. That's the case where the Montana court, although it's still on appeal to the Montana Supreme Court, held that there is, based on the Montana state constitution, some fundamental right of citizens of that state to a clean environment. The federal scale, we saw the kids lawsuit from Oregon that failed, but internationally, there's been some success with plaintiff group, public interest groups suing both national governments as well as individual corporations and having some success in claiming that their fundamental human rights have been violated. So for instance, there's a famous now opinion out of the Netherlands, and it's the Urinda opinion that was issued a few years ago, where a group of private citizens in the Netherlands said, hey, the Dutch government is not actually taking climate change seriously, very similar to the Oregon suit in the United States. But there, the Dutch courts said, you're right, the Dutch government hasn't been taking climate change seriously, and they need to do more to cut their greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for climate change. And similarly, there's another lawsuit filed against Shell in the Netherlands, where at first they actually won a ruling saying, Shell, you have to cut down your emissions by a certain amount. But just recently, a few weeks ago, the Dutch court overturned that. So there is this concept, particularly internationally, that there's some sort of societal duty to be cognizant of how much greenhouse gas emissions your company or you individually may be producing and how that might impact climate change. So we see a lot more of that success for those environmental plaintiffs internationally than we do in the United States currently.
When you talk about the role governments play in climate change litigation, you touched a little bit on them as defendants, but are they also pushing for stricter regulations?
Well, yes. And so in those 30 lawsuits I mentioned, you actually see state and local governments saying, we are the plaintiff and we're going after these oil and gas companies to fix their damages, pay billions of dollars to either deal with the costs of mitigating or adapting to climate change, or in some cases, we've seen a trend recently where some of these jurisdictions have said, we think your marketing oil and gas company is deceptive, particularly where you see oil and gas companies now sometimes making statements about trying to reduce carbon emissions or working on alternative fuel sources other than fossil fuels. And so what some of these state and local governments have done is saying, well, we think that's deceptive. And so we're going to sue you to change that marketing, and then also to try to recover some of the profits that you may have got because of that marketing. So you see both the governments, particularly the federal government as a defendant, but then these state and local governments in the United States really being active plaintiffs against particularly the fossil fuel industry.
All right, now I'm going to ask you a tough question. All right, you ready, Oliver?
All right.
How do you see climate change litigation evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? And what major legal developments or trends do you foresee coming to fruition?
Well, right now, there are 2 cases pending before the United States Supreme Court. There are petitions for the Supreme Court to effectively take the case. In one instance, a climate change lawsuit brought by Honolulu in Hawaii, and trying to get the Supreme Court to take whether or not those cases should proceed in state court or if the cases should be dismissed. And so it's unclear, particularly with the change of administration, although the administration doesn't necessarily directly affect the Supreme Court has asked the United States Solicitor General to weigh into those lawsuits. And the Biden administration Solicitor General has not yet done that. And so how the Solicitor General, whether it's the Biden administration and or the Trump administration, incoming Solicitor General, files their brief, whether or not they think the Supreme Court should take the case, will really dictate the future. Because if the Supreme Court says, no, we're not going to take this case at this point, And I think a lot of these lawsuits will continue to proceed and many more may be filed, uncertain. But then if the Supreme Court says, no, these cases should not pass muster, they should be dismissed, then I think that you'll see that the litigation brought by state and local governments with these outside plaintiff lawyers really kind of dry up. But we'll still have the administrative types of issues in the states that pass certain disclosure laws like we talked about, like California's. You'll still see federal administrations, trying to implement policies like the SEC climate disclosure rules. And I think ultimately there will be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of litigation until the U.S. Congress acts and really makes clear who has responsibility where and what is the nation's policy going forward. Because otherwise, you run the risk of having a patchwork of 30 different rulings in different states and jurisdictions that are just wildly inconsistent. And so I think that result of that continuing litigation from those state and local governments will have an incredible effect on the price of oil and gas. And really driving that up unless Congress steps in and says, no, we need to stop this. This is what our solution for climate change is going to be going forward.
Yeah, and I imagine no matter what, you're still going to see the special interest groups and the activists and stuff. Those lawsuits will probably continue to come, right?
That's right. I think that there will always be the technical arguments that can be made on certain allowable emissions. I think those lawsuits will continue to happen regardless of what happens on the tort side, where the state and local governments are suing for the alleged injuries that they think that the fossil fuel industry in particular has caused. But I don't see this limited really to the fossil fuel industry, because if there is success there and those suits are allowed to continue, I think any industry that's heavy in manufacturing, particularly the automotive industry, the petrochemical industry, those will be some of the next targets for these environmental activists. And you're already starting to see that with the California AG and the New York AG filing lawsuits with respect to plastic pollution or alleged plastic pollution. And so I don't think that if climate change dies on the vine, that means that we'll never have any litigation related to climate again, because I think it'll just expand beyond just true fossil fuel products to other products that affect the climate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's certainly going to be interesting to watch. Well, thank you for tuning in to Deals and Disputes with West Webb, Albritton, and Gentry. And a big thank you to my special guest, Oliver Peter Thoma. If you'd like to connect with the firm, you can visit westwebblaw.com, and that's web with 2 B's. And please like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review in the comments. Oliver, I really appreciate your time and all your insight. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.